Okay, let's continue our discussion on deep structure of culture and more specifically worldview, which is a type of deep structure. So on the end of the first part of this discussion, I was talking about how you have these common differences, such as power dynamics or how different genders are viewed within the culture. So to give you some examples of worldview and kind of like just elements of that in American culture, an example of the American culture, as I mentioned, it would be like capitalism is good, democracy is good, the Constitution, right? Like lots of things in the Constitution. So, for example, um, everybody's created equally, right? Equal access to justice and things like that. So these are all elements of our culture, and the Constitution is an example of those elements just being, put into paper on, put down in writing, right? Enumerated for anybody to read and see. That's certainly like a dynamic of us, right? Certainly, traditionally, we've had this dynamic of being, you might have heard the phrase the melting pot, which is this notion of we're a culture that certainly traditionally has embraced diversity, right? And that's a common dynamic, right? That's been sort of a deep rooted structure of our culture. So you've got democracy, capitalism, embracing diversity, certain things that are kind of like enumerated within the Constitution. All men are created equal, essentially, right, under the law, equal access to justice, and things like that. So other examples, certainly in American culture, there's a strong sort of religious affiliation. So people are less like different studies on like what kind of role does religion play in people's lives. Now, first of all, this obviously varies by culture in terms of like groups. And so, for example, certain nationalities, certain ethnicities tend to be more religious than others. But just to kind of use American culture as an example, because religion, look, it is a common uh, element of deep structure. So in American culture, while current generations tend to be less religious than prior ones, certainly traditionally American culture, a deep element of it has been Christian Catholic denomination of religion, as well as Jewish denominations and things like that. So those tend to be the common ones in American culture. Again, plays less of a role now, but it's still a pretty significant role. And there's two ways you can kind of see this. So one is just practically, okay? So yes, people are less religious, but if you don't think that plays a role, look around you, drive around, right? Count how many churches you see. Still a lot of them, right? So if we're just going to look at like just basic membership based on that, still playing a role. Another thing that you can sort of see it is look, prior generations were more religious, right? And so if they had that kind of mindset of these typically, again, Christian, Catholic, Jewish denominations, right? They take those worldviews in how they live their life, including how they socialize their children and their family members, right? How they suggest they should live their life, right? That then they then go out into the world and they enact laws, right? They try to advocate for certain things. They run businesses that try to promote certain things. So, in other words, the morals or the belief systems of a culture's religious underpinnings tend to like permeate into other aspects, right? So, an example would be like in the United States, since we're using this as an example of American sort of deep structure. So I'm saying, hey, look, religion plays a big role. So some of it's because, hey, a lot of our members have been, a lot of people in the United States have been religious in previous generations, and still a lot are now. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that um, it's not just that affiliation and sort of like how they then view the world, but then they go out and live their life a certain way and promote living a certain way, which then sort of affects how society then operates, right? So an example would be again from my field as an attorney. So look, we have a separation of church and state. That is true. And there's debate on whether or not that's appropriately applied or not. But regardless, so yeah, we have a separation of church and state, but that does not mean that religious morals, values, and norms don't have an influence on our laws. Of course they do, because they're the values, norms, and beliefs of the people who enact those laws, right? So, so it still comes into play. It still influences things. right? Um, so religion tells us like stealing is wrong, and we have laws against stealing, right? Like I don't, I'm just trying to use like the most innocent, mundane example, but so it plays a role, is what I'm trying to say, is because we're just direct members. People that are religious are direct members of these types of things, which influences their way of thinking. But then again, they go out and they sort of like create a society that lives a certain way, which then teaches other members to live that way. And again, they also literally enact legislation and things like that that influences things. So certainly American culture, religion plays a big role. It less in current generations, right? Certainly than before, but it's still there, right? It's still there. And again, other cultures. It's easier for me to use American culture as the example, but obviously other cultures, it's different religions sometimes, or different influences and level of influence, right? So, like, for example, in modern times, there's some other cultures that certainly have bigger religious influences than the United States. To give you some specific examples of some of these different dynamics of deep structure, so Anglo cultures, they tend to be more individualistic, meaning focus on you, focus sort of, you don't necessarily have to worry about yeah, you care about the bigger picture, but ultimately you focus on you, and are you getting in life to a place in life you want to be. They tend to be performance based oriented. So again, focus on, are you winning or losing, right, at life. Forward looking, look at the future, like where are things going. Gender equality is generally valued. But again, this goes back to like, do they actually walk the talk? So generally in Anglo cultures, like American culture, right? If we're talking about just nationality of the United States, right? Gender equality is stated to be valued, but in practice, right, not quite there. Certainly better than some other countries, but certainly not quite there totally. And they still tend to be kind of male dominated. So that just tends to be what still happens. So that's an example. But now, just to kind of compare that, let's look at some Latin American cultures. So they tend to be more paternalistic, right? Perspective is a central theme. So the people in that power, who have power, tend to restrict freedoms out of the best interests of the subordinate. So they tend to take this approach of, you have this collection of power, right? They make the decisions, and that they, whatever they think is in the best interests, right, of the people who don't have power. So, and obviously that can sometimes be a good thing. Sometimes people have power for a reason, because they are more experienced, right? And they're in a better position to know the right decision, right? And it's like in my field, there's when a judge makes a ruling, the reason the judge is making the ruling is because they're experienced, right? It's part of why they're a judge, and they're not being paid by one side, right? There's a reason they have the power. So that tends to be their focus, I guess, in a lot of Latin American cultures, is that's how they kind of organize things. Um, they tend to socialize people to care a lot about social status and like maintaining whatever your social status is, right? So that could be everything. That's not just like keep up with the Joneses, right? Like materialism. That could be just simply don't bring dishonor on your family, right? Don't disrespect, certain social dynamics, whether it's how you're perceived or your family's perceived, right? They tend to engage in in-group collectivism, meaning they tend to focus a lot on what's good for the whole. So what's good for my family, what's good for my community, right? And then all the way up to things like nationality and country and ethnicity and that sort of stuff. There's also a sense of fatalism in these cultures. So in other words, sort of this notion that like things are predetermined, right? So it's essentially like you have a certain destiny that's gonna happen either way, and you certainly try to do the things that are going to lead you to this outcome, but there's this sense that the outcome is predetermined. So I'm just giving you kind of some common deep rooted, again, deep structure, right, beliefs that these cultures have. So we talked about American culture, now it's going on to more Latin Americans, right? And obviously this isn't an exhaustive list, there's more, just gives you some idea of some of them. Prefer to live life in the present rather than planning for the future. So on one hand, there's this sense of like fatalism, like things are predetermined. And so what that tends to lead to is this perspective of, hey, live for now, man. Like, and not as much focused on like, driving ahead of the car in the future, right? Tomorrow is promised to no one. And so they focus on today. And so that's kind of an example of some of these differences. And we're going to come back to these terms here on like collectivism, by the way, and individualism that I mentioned before in a second. But individualism is, again, just focusing on you and what you're looking, what your goals and objectives are. Collectivism is what's good for the group, right? Gender roles, since we mentioned that earlier, this chart, you don't have to know all these or memorize these or anything. I just wanted to give you an example of some of the differences, right? So again, like we're talking about here, U.S. males tend to be socialized to be successful. And this is actually talking about how, so this isn't talking about like equality or something like that. What we're focusing on here is how men and women are socialized. Okay. So like, in other words, what society tells you you're supposed to sort of think, be, or believe. Okay. So in the US, males tend to be socialized to be successful, like that's important, right? Achieve, achieve, achieve. To be more aggressive, right? Sexuality, right? Embrace their sexuality and self-reliant. Okay. Females tend to be still socialized to be more nurturing, sensitive, interdependent on each other, right? So focus on the family or like relationship connections, things like that. Appearance is a big one. And then consciousness, right? So I'm sorry, I screwed that up. Appearance conscious, so meaning care a lot about how you look, right? I personally think, as somebody with a background in communication, specifically with mass media, that this is a massive problem right now. I think in today's culture, things are getting worse and worse within the sense of certainly in American culture where look, I think women are definitely being told from almost every certainly from mass media that their value is in their appearance. And what matters is how good you look or attractive you're perceived. I think it's a massive problem, whether it's social media, advertising, to even just industries. Like what they're telling you matters. And so look, I don't think it's great. It's personal, pet peeve of mine. I think that's getting worse and not great. But this is an example of like just even traditionally, not just today, like how American culture tends to be. And then since we used Latin cultures as a previous example, so if you look at this chart here, in Latin cultures, men tend to be socialized as the undisputed authority, right? As the ones who kind of should be in charge. An example would be oldest son assumes roles when the father is absent, things like that. And then they tend to focus a lot on motherhood, right? That it's really important for women to expand the family, bring children, raise children. That should be their goal. To be homemakers and things like that. Again, that's changing, it's evolving, but that's still a big, strong underpinning, right? And give you, by the way, an example of that evolving is like U.S. culture. If you go back about 40 years to 30 years or so, was big on that too. Where, if it's the 1980s and or the 70s or so, maybe you gotta go back like 50 years, but like if it's the 80s or 70s and you're a 20-year-old female, it's like, hey man, get married, start having kids. Like what's the deal? What's the deal on that? Better get going, right? So like our culture was certainly like, when I say our American culture was certainly a lot like that 40, 50 years ago. And so that's still dominant with a lot of cultures around. And so I give you a couple other examples here, certainly Asian cultures, Arab cultures, and things like that. So if you want to see some of these gender role differences, okay, this kind of gives you an idea of how people with a male identity tend to be socialized and female identities tend to be socialized by the larger group. And when I say socialized, again, we're talking about what they're told should be their goals or their aspirations or their role, and what they're told by their families, by media, right, by the government, by schools, right, social institutions, things like that. Just kind of like everything, right? So this gives you an example of that. Here's another little side one that I thought was interesting, which is some of these deep structure differences in like how we treat the elderly, right? So in the U.S., we're big on youth, right? And there tends to be an age bias. We tend to disregard not just like opinions and perspectives of people that are older, right? And we get to this point where we just sort of disregard them, right? All the way to the point where if you get elderly, where you're kind of like forgotten and totally disregarded versus again, keeping with our theme here of like the two cultures we've been comparing is like Latin cultures where it's the opposite, where elderly people are really respected and cared for, right? And held in um, really held in high esteem. And Asian cultures will tend to do this as well. So there's a really big difference there. So this kind of gives you an example. So we talk in here about U.S. culture, Native American cultures as well, Arab cultures, Latin, Asian. So this kind of gives you an idea of how these like really strong fundamental things about life, right? Because getting old is an aspect of life, right? That is universal to hopefully as many of us as possible. And yet we see these really big divergences in how we handle these things. So just kind of gives you, again, you don't have to memorize all these, but I want the point for you here is not that I'm going to test you and say, so how do Arab cultures treat the elderly, right? Like that's not what I'm going to ask you. What I want you to understand is that this is a dynamic that is how we treat the elderly is a dynamic of deep structure, right? And that it's different, it's divergent with different groups. So it gives you a good example. Now, I want to talk about this thing here called high and low context cultures. So high and low context cultures is basically dealing with this how they kind of like look at communication and kind of some focus issues. So high context cultures, they tend to rely more on implicit communication and nonverbal cues. They communicate in a manner that gives deference to how it will affect others. And they tend to be concerned with relationships. So in other words, they will rely a little bit more on nonverbals. You don't have to literally state certain things, right? They will take non-literal context factors like tone of voice and setting and situation. But the big thing about what I want you to remember about high context cultures that they do is they focus on how does this affect the group? They're concerned with relationships. Okay. Low context cultures communicate as directly as possible, right? So they don't rely as much on like context or nonverbals. I mean, nonverbals is still a huge role, but my point is they got something to say, they'll just say it. Right? I'm just telling it like it is. Right? If you got an issue, I got a tissue. Tough. Right? They'll just be blunt, right? So they communicate as directly as possible, and nonverbal aspects again they're still a big role, but they're minimized, and it's self-concern. So in other words, high context cultures, when you communicate with people, if you're in one of those groups, you focus on, all right, what's best for the group, what's best for everybody. I don't want to like offend people, I don't want to piss people off, I just want to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish or communicate what I want to communicate. Low context cultures, it's about me, myself, and I'm going to say what I need to say because I need to say it, right? Or I'm going to accomplish what I want to accomplish because I need to accomplish it, whatever my goal is. And I don't really care if it pisses you off. Okay? Now, look, there's pros and cons to both of this, right? But this is an example of like high versus low. Now, here's the thing about like high versus low context cultures. Now, this chart kind of gives you the gamut here, right? So high context, like just kind of focused on the group, would be like certainly a lot of Chinese and Asian cultures do that, where you do what's best for the society at large, the family unit, right? Some Greek cultures, certainly Hispanic, Latino cultures will do that. American culture, to give you an example, to go on the other end, is very individualistic, right? You focus on you, and if other people get offended, it's not that I want to offend them, but sorry, I'm focused on me. Now, by the way, in other words, we're very individualistic. Now, again, there's pros and cons to both. By the way, I will say, if you don't think we're individualistic, like the only example you need is go on social media, any platform. So first of all social media is everybody's PR firm, right? It's everybody trying to make themselves look the best that they can or draw attention to themselves, right? It's all me, myself, and I, right? So whether we're talking about Facebook, where it's like I'm going to show the world my best life, I'm living it, right? Instagram, for you younger kids out there, that's really look at me. I mean, there's a reason we have the term Instagram model, right? People going on Instagram, I'm hot. Look at how hot I am. Hopefully you DM me, right? Um, X, okay, uh, basically post after post to just get attention, good or bad, right? You're just literally trying to get engagement, okay? It's all individualistic, right? And I'm not even including. So it's focused on you. What is your goal? It doesn't really matter how it affects somebody else, right? I mean, you see that anytime somebody on X, for example, has a post and it's just vicious and awful, and it gets lots of engagement, but does nothing but like hurt people, or they have a post where they insinuate themselves into a situation where the text thread wasn't even addressed to them, right? It has nothing to do with you. Why are you commenting on this, right? Who cares what you think on this, right? It has nothing to do with you. But yet the people like jump in, right? Because they want attention, or they're trying to get engagement, they're trying to get clicks, right? Whatever it may be. Like, you've experienced this, right? Or seen this probably if you've been on social media. And so it's all look at me. It's all look at me. Who cares how it affects other people? Who cares? Right? It's all look at me. And so that's kind of like the proof of how individualistic we are. Another example that I mentioned sports earlier. If you're a fan of professional sports, I mean, I like sports, is look at what happens. I mean, every Sunday you're watching a football game, a guy scores a touchdown in the second quarter of like week 3 of the NFL season in a random meaningless game, or in a game where his team's down 21 points, and he's dancing around in the end zone like he's just won the Super Bowl, right? Um, Steph Curry hits a 3 in the middle of a meaningless regular season game, and he's doing all kinds of stuff, gyrates, antics, going down the court. Name whatever hand signal, gesture, whatever. When it's like the second quarter of a regular season game, right? Baseball, my favorite sport. Guys, they hit a home run, regular season game. The team's still down by 5 runs, and they're flipping the bat, and they're dancing around the bases. They're what now? Is that about sportsmanship? Is that about go team? Yay team! So proud of my team, my coaches. That's look at me, 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 me. Right? So that just tells you. And by the way, I just went through social media and like sports with a lot of tone in my voice. That's very cynical, right? Like I don't like it. So before you say like old man shouts at cloud, because I realize I sound like an old man right now criticizing this stuff. Okay, so dropping the sarcasm now. Okay, here's my point about that. Those are just examples of how American culture is very individualistic, right? It's the proof of it. So how we engage, how we use our social media platforms is all about drawing attention to ourselves. What's in it for me? It's either literally drawing attention or trying to profit off that, or right, it's all about look at me. And how we engage with sports, how you see players act, also is a lot about look at me. Now, again, I said that with a lot of tone because, yes, there are things about that I don't like, that I think are not healthy for society or the culture, or not the right lessons to be teaching people, or socializing people to think is a good thing, right? But that doesn't mean, obviously, again, being all serious now, look, there are true benefits to social media. It doesn't mean that all of the platforms are all terrible, that offer nothing positive. Obviously, there's positive to that. There's lots of positive things about sports, right? So I'm not saying it's all terrible. And quite frankly, there's times in life where there's lots of positive things about being individualistic, right? Like, that's how people stand up for themselves. That's how people sometimes maximize their potential and talent. That's how sometimes you can actually help others more, right? By making sure you're taking care of you. So I'm not saying that individual cultures is all bad. I mean, those examples are kind of like examples of, certainly from my tone, of like some of the bad, but there's definitely some benefits of that. And Obviously, high context cultures that focus on the groups, the benefits of that is, yeah, you maintain harmony in the group and you kind of do what's best for others. So it's very like altruistic. So the benefits are kind of more obvious, but that can be bad too, right? Like sometimes if you're just doing what's best for the group, sometimes you're blindly like not really protecting yourself, right? Sometimes you're not addressing something that needs to be addressed. Okay. So this would be an example where you see this sometimes in family units where a parent sometimes is not like honest with their children because it's their children. They love their children. They don't want to think poorly of them or have like critical thoughts about them. So they're just not honest about a situation. And then a problem doesn't get addressed. Right. I actually have to deal with that sometimes in my practice. Like I've had this happen with clients where um, kid does something, little Johnny's in trouble, and the parents are like, I'm gonna put up my house for bail for little Johnny, right? So they can get out of prison while they wait trial or something. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this, how bail, excuse me, how this works is when you put your house up or you give money right to the court as collateral, and then the person gets out on bail. What that house of the money does is it basically is like assurance that they're going to show up. So if little Johnny skips town, right? Guess what? The court takes your house. They keep the money, and then they go find little Johnny, right? And they keep the stuff, right? So the parents will come in. They'll be like, "We're going to put our house up. We're going to cash out our 401k. We're doing all this stuff to get little Billy out of jail because little Billy didn't do this, and I don't want him rotting in prison, right?" And sometimes you're looking at this and you kind of know that little Billy's going to run. Little Johnny. I keep changing the kid's name. Little Johnny's going to run. Like they should not put their house up for bail. And I tell them like, don't do that. No, don't do that. That's not a good idea. And they no. They're going to do it. And sometimes I have to do the thing where it's like, okay, time out, right? And I go, all right, this is not time out from it. This is not legal advice. Let me ask you a question. And they go, okay. And I say, do you think there's a-holes in the world? There are jerks out there. And I go, yeah. And I go, all right, I got one more question for you. Do you think it's possible Johnny's one of the a-holes? Sometimes the jerk's in your family. Sometimes you're the jerk, right? Sometimes you're the a-hole and you just won't admit it, right? And you got to come to grips with that. So I would not put the house up for little Johnny to get bail because he's going to leave, right? And you're going to lose your house. So, so this family dynamic is like we see this where sometimes family members because parents love their children, they're so blind, right? They just can't think their kids can do any wrong. And so, but what's going on? That's a collectivist mindset, right? Like to give you an example, because we're all parts of families, right? Where that collectivist mindset of what's best for the group, what's best for the family just kind of like takes over, and you're not being honest with yourself about the right way to handle this situation, right? And it can work the other way too, by the way. Sometimes parents are too hard on their children because of their own hangups and they're not giving the children the credit they deserve, right? But anyways, like you can sometimes when you're trying to do what's best for the group, um, you're not really doing the right thing, right? Because you're not addressing a problem that needs to be addressed. I guess maybe a better example of that in my field would be like sometimes when say a doctor commits malpractice, it's hard to find other doctors who will testify that they committed malpractice because they're like protecting each other, right? Or it's like in law enforcement sometimes, like the blue wall or the blue shield, where cop does something wrong and other cops won't just, admit, provide the evidence they did the thing wrong because they're covering for each other, right? Which is not really what's best for society. Like, it's not good for society if we have doctors that commit malpractice. It's not good for society if we have bad cops, right? What's good for society is we have great doctors and really good cops, and we have a lot of both, right? But that's probably a better example, maybe than little Billy and bail. But I don't know. I guess now you have some bail pro tips, right? But so collectivist cultures, right? They look out for the whole group, but that can be bad too. So you got both going on. Here's some other, again, common characteristics of low and high context cultures, right? Um, Again, you don't have to memorize all these. I just want to go through some differences in the dynamic. So again, it really comes down to focusing on the group or focusing on the individual. What are you taught to do? Um, and this just kind of gives you, right, sort of like some of the differences. So to give you an example, is like, look at commitments, right? So high context cultures where it's like, hey, what matters is the group, what matters is the collective. They kind of teach people like commitment matters. Like your word is your bond, right? You belong to this, you're committed to this, you need to stick it out. Versus low context cultures where you're doing what's best for you. Hey man, I'm looking out for me. Right? So like they don't really emphasize commitment. Like you may be a really loyal person, but at the end of the day, you're loyal to yourself, right? Kind of thing. So that's kind of like in a difference. So this I just want to give you a couple of these differences. We talked about before that high context cultures tend to be a little more implicit, indirect about how they communicate. And actually, if you think about it, that should be intuitive. So why would they do that versus like low context cultures? They're just like, I'm going to tell it like it is, right? Is because if you're high context, you care about the group, you're gonna you might say things more indirectly because you want to make sure you say them in a way that doesn't offend people, right? You want to make sure you're kind of like a little more PC about it. Or just PC really isn't the right word, but like just not offending, not offensive, like face saving, identity saving, right? Kind of stuff. So, which is actually good in a lot of like in terms of communication in general. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. That is a good thing, but it gives you an example of some of these differences. So again, I'm not going to test you on do you understand all of these differences, but I wanted to kind of show you what they are. All right, dominant and co-cultures. This is something that we're going to get into in the third part of this series here. So tune in for that. But this is basically the difference between groups that have huge numbers of people that most people around you tend to be involved in versus the ones that are a little more unique to you. So we're going to cover that in the third part of this lecture video.